Good morning.
All right, everybody. We are in Matthew chapter 24, beginning today at verse 15. So let me say up front. So last week, we had that interesting lesson of looking at the first 14 verses in Matthew 24, and we had the discussion about the two different ways to interpret those verses. We continue that discussion today. And let me say again that, again, there's two different ways to interpret these verses. One is that they really have to do with prophecy about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70. And the other interpretation is that they are about the end times and the final tribulation. And we could just dismiss this if it wasn't, we could just pick one if it wasn't that there are pastors in our church who have two different opinions on these things. And so so what I'm going to be doing actually as we go into verses 15 and following, because I really think it's, instead of thinking this is one or the other, it's either this or that. I really like to think about it as here's the near-term fulfillment and here's the far-term fulfillment. In the same way that we talk about those things in the Old Testament, right? There's a near-term and a far-term fulfillment. So when I talk about, especially when we get down to 16 and following, or 15 and following, we'll be talking about the near-term fulfillment, i.e., what supports the interpretation that all these things happen around AD 70 when the temple is destroyed, and the far-term fulfillment, which is really about the end time. So you guys are willing, are able to pick whichever one you really like, and no harm, no foul. All right, but let's get started. I want to go back to verse 14 to start, just to make sure you understand where we are. It says, in this gospel, the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. So what he really picks up on in verse 15 is the end will come. And the question is, when will that happen? And what's the sign of the end coming? And again, the end has these two different interpretations, the end being the end of the temple in AD 70, or the end of everything in the final tribulation and the final destruction of the earth and the coming of the millennial kingdom, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll get into some of that as we get into this. So verse 15 says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. So he says that the first sign, the first thing that you're going to see is the abomination of desolation that's spoken of by Daniel. Abomination, that's a word that means, something detestable, something repulsive. There's some kind of repulsiveness, something that is that desecrates the temple that Daniel is speaking of. So we need to go back and look at Daniel and see what he's talking about. So go back and find Daniel. Fortunately, we studied Daniel not too long ago, but Daniel chapter 11. I'm just going to look at a couple of verses just to kind of remind you what the story is and what is he talking about, this abomination of desolation. So Daniel chapter 11. I'm assuming you can find Daniel since we studied it not that long ago. So Daniel 11, let's start at verse 11. So here you have the king of the south shall be moved with rage and go out and fight with him, and the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude with the multitude, shall be given into the hand of the enemy. When he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up and he will be cast down, tens of thousands, but he will not prevail, for the king of the north will return, So you'll remember then that we've got this great battle going on here that's described about the king of the north coming down. So that's the first piece of this. So look it down to verse 31, yeah, chapter 11, verse 31. Verse 31 says, "And the forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation." So in verse 31, where it says mustered by him, again, we're talking about this king of the north who comes down, and that he's going to take away the daily sacrifices and place there an abomination of desolation. Let's keep reading a little bit. Verse 32, "Those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. And those are the people who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days thou shalt fall by the sword and flame, by captivity and plundering." Now, if you remember, those of you who have good memories will remember when we talked about the abomination of desolation back in Daniel. About 400 years after Daniel, there was a Syrian king who came in. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes. He came into the temple. He actually slaughtered pigs on the altar. He stuffed pork down the throats of the priests, and he actually set up Zeus in the temple. Right. So this was the very first um, abomination of desolation that occurred when the Syrian king came in. So the first early fulfillment of this prophecy was done by the Syrian king in about 400 years after Daniel. So if you look at, again, in verse Daniel 11, again, look at verse 36. Verse 36, "Then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all." Right. So again, this was a prophecy that was fulfilled by this Syrian king who set himself up as God in the temple, put up the statue of Zeus, and completely defiled the temple. Now, when we studied Daniel and we talked about these verses, we said this was the early fulfillment of the prophecy, and the last fulfillment of the prophecy is obviously when the Antichrist comes in, sets himself in the temple, and defiles the temple. All right, so now with that as background, let's go back to Matthew. Go back to Matthew. And it says there, again, let me just read the verse again. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place." So again, there was this early fulfillment of this prophecy by the Syrian king. The folks who want to interpret these verses as this is the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem say, well, this temple got defiled, obviously, when the Roman soldiers came in. They come in with their eagle standards, right? You remember they had the eagles on long poles. They brought these into the temple. They would actually worship the standards, which was a symbol of the Caesar, right? And so they were defiling the temple by coming in with these standards, by bringing in Caesar's image, if you will. Look just for a minute. Look over at Luke chapter 21, which is the parallel verse. Luke chapter 21, verse 20. Luke 21:20, and it says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near." Right. So here they're talking about, this is similar verses, but it's very clear here they're talking about Jerusalem surrounded by armies. Right. It feels more like a physical destruction of the temple, the way Luke writes about it, than the way that Matthew writes about it. Abomination of desolation. So again, for the near-term interpretation, this is the Roman legions who come in, and their abomination is bringing these eagle standards into the temple. The far-term, again, interpretation, if you go to Revelation chapter 13, Go to the Revelation, chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13, just to verse 1. And there's a lot more verses, but I'm just pulling out these just to remind you of our study of Revelation. In verse 1, it says, Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads, 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, whose feet were like the feet of a bear, his mouth like the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him power, his throne, and authority. So the beast here again is the Antichrist. You notice it says it gives him a throne. It was given to him by the dragon being Satan. So here is, you can continue reading in chapters 15 about the beast, and essentially he puts himself up as God in the temple, sets himself up there. So there you have the final fulfillment of it, and there's a similar verses in 2 Thessalonians. Let's just turn there for a minute to 2 Thessalonians. Is right after 1 Thessalonians.
Before 1 Timothy.
In the T section.
In the T section. All you gotta do is find it. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2.
What page number?
2.
I'm sorry?
What page number?
1466.
Got it.
2 Thessalonians chapter 2, just to read a verse 1 there. It says, Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ has come. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Okay. So again, this is the end times fulfillment, that the Antichrist comes, he sets himself in the temple, he sets himself up as God. And so verse 15 then, depending on your interpretation, this abomination of desolation is someone who comes into the temple, sets himself up as God. Now, so let's keep going. Now, and the question then is, okay, if this happens, when this happens, how should the people respond? And we see that in verse 16. It says, Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. All right. So this is the instructions. Get out. When you see this happen, when you see the abomination of desolation happen, you're to run and get out as fast as you can. As long as you stay in Jerusalem, you're going to be killed. Anyone who will not bow to this authority, anyone who does not bow to either the Caesar, or who does not bow to the Antichrist, is going to be killed. In Zechariah, it talks about two of every 3 people will be killed. I mean, this is a widespread destruction that happens. He continues to talk about this in verse 17 through 19. It says, Let him who is on the housetop not go. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not go back to take his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. And I pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. So very simply, these are pretty obvious. But verse 17, right? You remember in those days that most of the houses had a rooftop area where people would spend the day because it was a little bit cooler than down in the house. And so they're saying, if you're up on the housetop, don't go back into the house to get anything. Don't take that much time. You just go down the stairs and get out of there. Same thing, if you're in the field, don't go back and get your tunic. Don't go back and get additional clothing. Just get out of there. Run to the mountains. And then woe to you who are pregnant and those who are nursing. 2 different interpretations of this. One It's hard to run when you're pregnant. It's hard to run when you're carrying a baby. But the other thing, there are prophecies that in these days the infants will be killed. Certainly that occurred during the destruction of Jerusalem. They wiped everyone out, and so they're saying, woe to you if you have a child during this time. They're going to be killed also. Um, Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Again, frankly, just because it's going to be really hard to travel. It's going to be really cold in the winter. And on the Sabbath, you remember that in Jewish rules, they were not allowed to travel on the Sabbath. And so, they didn't want to have that kind of conflict. Well, it's the Sabbath. I certainly can't run, not allowed to run on the Sabbath, not allowed to make a long trip on the Sabbath. And so pray it doesn't happen on the Sabbath, so you're able to get out of there and you don't have those issues, right? So all of that again is just saying, when this happens, we need you to get out of there, and we need you to get out of there fast. Now, this applies to both the near and far term interpretation. Obviously, when the Romans came and destroyed the temple and the city, the advice was get out of there and hide in the mountains, and they did. They went up and hid in the caves during that time. And again, if it's the end times, he's saying you need to get out of there when this destruction comes, when Jerusalem is laid waste, when the Antichrist takes over. It's time for you to get out of town and not be in the midst of all that. All right. By the way, feel free to interrupt me and go, what? Verse 21. Verse 21. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be, right? The worst time ever is about to happen. The worst time, the greatest tribulation that you've ever seen. Now, let me just say this. For most of us, our interpretation is that this is about the end times, right? And when you're talking about this is the worst time ever, obviously they're talking about the final tribulation. It says there the great tribulation, right? They're obviously talking about the final judgment at the end. So how are these people thinking that this could possibly be just about the destruction of Jerusalem? One thing that you do need to recognize is that the siege and destruction of Jerusalem was a horrible, overwhelming event. And in those days, people were saying, this is the worst destruction that has ever happened. This is the worst calamity that has ever befallen on a nation, the destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, I have a little quote here. You know that there's a historian named Josephus who just wrote history about the Jews, and I got a little quote here. Let me just find it here. He says, all the calamities, says he, which have befallen any nation from the beginning of the world were but small in comparison to the destruction of Jerusalem. So that's the first thing. Then he goes on to say, it says he has given the following account of one part of the massacre when the city was taken. And now rushing into the city, they slew whomsoever they found without distinction, and burned the houses and all the people who had fled into them. When they entered for the sake of the plunder, they found whole families of dead persons and houses full of carcasses destroyed by famine. Then they came out with their hands empty. And though they thus pitied the dead, they were not the same emotion for the living, but killed all they met, whereby they filled the lanes with dead bodies. The whole city ran with blood, insomuch that many things that were burning were extinguished by the flow of blood. So I just want to give you some perspective on this destruction of Jerusalem was a horrific event. And so when people try to say, well, that this, this great tribulation certainly can be attributed to the temple, this is why, because it was a horrible, overwhelming, incredible, both siege and destruction that happened during this time. Now, obviously, you still can't compare that to the end time. So go to Revelation chapter 8, just to kind of remind you. Revelation chapter 8. We're here in the middle in Revelation chapter 8. We got the horn sounding, we got the seals opening, we got the bowls being dumped out. Just in Revelation chapter 8, just to give you a flavor for this, look at verse 7. Right, where we got the trumpets beginning to sound. It says, the first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. Then the second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea became blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, a third of the ships were destroyed. Then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch. It fell in a third of the rivers and the springs of the earth. The name of the star is wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood. Many men died from the water because it was made bitter. Then the fourth angel sounded, a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, a third of the stars. So the third of them were darkened, a third of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. And looked, I heard an angel flying in the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because the remaining blasphemous trumpets of the three angels who are about to sound when it actually gets worse, right? And by the way, don't, we certainly talked about this before, but, when you talk about a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, a third of the stars, a third of them were darkened, a third of the day is not shine, this disrupts everything, right? I mean, there's no planting, there's no growing of crops, there's no sense of what day and what night is anymore. So when we see huge famine overtaking them in the end times, this is why there's no way that they can get food anymore, etc. So certainly those who, going back to Matthew now, those who believe that this great tribulation, is really about the end times and what's happening in the seals and the trumpets and the bowls, certainly have a good reason for that kind of understanding, because there's certainly nothing like that tribulation which has ever happened before. So again, we have the near-term fulfillment in the destruction of Jerusalem, the far-term fulfillment in the end times when all these things occur. Verse 22. By the way, you may be thinking I'm going pretty quickly through these, because I am. Mainly because we covered a lot of this stuff when we covered Daniel and Revelation, and so I'm just kind of reminding you of what we learned there and bringing out some new insights that we have not dealt with before. Like in verse 22, it says, unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. So a couple things here. The first thought is that, well, he's just saying here that this destruction, this tribulation, God only made it so long because otherwise everyone would be killed. Everyone would be wiped out because of what has happened here, right? But for the elect's sake, those days were shortened. By the way, this is the first time that the word elect is used in Scripture, and all of the commentaries agree that when we talk about elect here, it's a combination of the elect out of the Jews and the elect out of the Gentiles. So it's the elect. It's those who are redeemed. It's those who are saved. And he's saying, unless the days were shortened of the tribulation, there would not be any of the elect left, right? They would all be taken away. Now, again, applying that to the near term, that's the destruction of Jerusalem. He's saying that there would not be, if they had just continued to, the Romans had continued to kill and to kill and to kill, they would have wiped everyone out. But there's always a remnant. And the same thing at the end times, if God had not shortened the tribulation, there would not have been anyone left. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But for the elect's sake, those days were shortened. Now, that's one interpretation of these verses. Another one, which is interesting, is, as I said earlier, because if you look at the tribulation, we talk about the sun being darkened, the stars being taken down, the moon being, its light being destroyed by 1/3. You certainly could say that, well, gee, the days are actually shortened by that, right? The days themselves become shorter. There's not as much light, so there's not as much time for the battle to go on, for the tribulation to continue. So that's another way of looking at this. Maybe that they shorten the day itself, or maybe that they just shorten the days. And frankly, the language in the Greek allows you to interpret it in both ways. But in either sense, the whole point is that the time of destruction has been shortened such that the elect are saved during that time. All right, verse 23 says, then if anyone says to you, look here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if people, even the elect. See, I have told you before. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out, or look, he is in the inner room, do not believe it. So here you have, we've talked about deception before in verses 1 through 14. Here you have false Christs and false prophets, right? Again, people who say they are the Christ and people who say they know the right way, right, will rise and show great signs and wonders, right? So they also, the false Christ, the false prophets are also given the ability to have signs and wonders at these times, right? They're able to perform some kind of signs and wonders that are pretty amazing, because it says there, if possible, even the elect will be fooled by them. Now, are the elect fooled by these signs and wonders? Are any of the elect fooled by these signs and wonders? That was a question looking for a response.
Not if they're paying attention.
Not if they're paying attention, and then frankly, not if they are the elect, right? So that's his point, saying, if possible, even the elect would be, would believe these false prophets, would follow these apostles. But the point he's trying to say is that's not possible, right? If they really are the elect, they're not going to follow these false prophets. These are for the false elect, if you will, right? Those who are just kind of the hangers-on. And we know what those are. We see them even in the church, right? People that are just there for the show, just there to show themselves off. But he's saying that the real elect are not going to be fooled by these false Christs and these false prophets. Now he is saying that. So let's just take the near-term view here first for a minute. When the Romans came in to destroy the temple, the people did flee out to the mountains, right? And then if you remember, they were turning people in and saying, well, these people are hiding up there in the mountains. These people, you need to go get them there, right? There were people that were going along with what was going on. And so what he's saying to them, listen, when people come to you and say, hey, listen, Jesus has returned. He's back. Look, let's go see him. Let's go take. No, they're fooling you. They're giving you bad information, right? Look at verse 26. Look, he's out in the desert, or look, he's in this secret room. Jesus is hiding there. He's saying, don't believe it, right? Why? Because in verse 27, when he comes, you're going to know it. But they are trying to deceive them. They're trying to say, it's time to come out from hiding. And you got to think that the people are pretty vulnerable at this point to deception, right? They're terrified about what's going on, in both cases. In the near term, when the Romans come, and in the far term during the tribulation, they're hiding from all the. Of course, if you continue to read Revelation, you'll remember that even the ones hiding in the caves get destroyed when the caves get destroyed. But that's what's going on here, and people are saying, oh, that he's come on out, it's okay, it'll be fine. And then, as I said in verse 27, though, he says when Jesus comes, it's going to be very different from that. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. So again, in the end times view, the far term view, right? This is when Jesus comes back onto the earth. He comes as lightning. We'll talk more about it when we get down to verse 30. But when he comes, everybody's going to know it. It's not going to be a secret. Somebody doesn't have to whisper to you that this has happened. Now you may ask, how is this interpreted in terms of the near-term prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, I will say one thing interesting in the commentaries. This is where the commentaries start hedging their bets and saying, well, he could also be talking about the end times here. He could also be talking about, when Jesus comes. But the hardcore AD 70 people will say this: the coming of the Son of Man is interpreted as Jesus bringing destruction upon Jerusalem, right? He comes and brings destruction as punishment for their unbelief. He comes and brings destruction. When it says lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, when the Romans came into Jerusalem, they actually came from the east of the city into the city and destroyed it. So again, the interpretation of this in the near-term view is this is the Romans. They're coming in from the east. They're coming in as agents of Christ to crush the city and punish them for their sin. So that is the near-term view of this. Again, the far-term view, as we said, is this is the actual return of Christ as he comes and sets foot on the earth. And we'll talk more about that when we get down to verse 30. And then in verse 28, for wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Now, in the near-term view, this is pretty simple, right? Wherever the carcass here is talking about the sinful people, right? The dead people, the people that are not following the Lord, not following Christ. They're being disobedient. They're the carcass, the dead people. The eagles, then, in the near-term view, this is obviously the Romans, right? Because they're coming in again with their standards that have eagles on it, and they are coming in as again tools of Christ to come in and take care of the carcass and to wipe them out. In the longer term view, this is actually God's judgment coming down on those sinners. Again, the carcass is the same as the sinners, those who do not follow Christ, and the eagles there are simply saying that this is where the destruction upon all mankind comes when they are gathered together and take care of the carcass, take care of those who are sinners. So let me just pause. I'm going back and forth. I'm trying to not get you confused, but at the same time trying to give you both of these. I'm just pausing to say, are you okay? You with me? Am I getting you too confused, or are we all right? Should I stop doing this?
We're okay.
All right, let's keep going. I must tell you that I'm looking forward to chapter 25, but we're going to make it through chapter 24. Verse 29, you ready? Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heavens will be shaken. So again, I will say that at this point, most of the commentaries have said, well, he's kind of changed over now and he's talking about the end times, right? I mean, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven. I mean, these are really quotes right out of Revelation, where it talks about what's going to happen at the end time. So there are a lot of the commentaries that at this point say, no, we understand that he's now talking, he switched from AD 70, he's now talking about the end times. Particularly because of the word immediately, right? Immediately after this tribulation, these things happen. This world darkens, et cetera, et cetera. And in Luke, it actually adds, and a lot more terrible things happen in addition to these. The heavens get shaken, right? And this is when this happens, if this is the end time, the stars do not give their light. You end up with total darkness, right? There is no more light anymore. The sun is darkened. People, you can imagine, living in total darkness, right? No more light. You can't see your hand in front of your face. I will say those who have the near-term view, say, well, this is simply an exaggerated statement about it's going to be really tough on the people of Jerusalem after the temple is destroyed, right? It's going to be really dark days. The powers of heaven will be shaken. They're really going to be shaken because God's temple has been destroyed. So that's how they justify these statements in the near-term view. And then we have verse 30. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So again, this is, let me just say, the near-term view here. Again, just they're saying that, after the temple is destroyed, people are mourning because of the temple is destroyed, and they certainly see the powers. There's great power coming, but again, the Son of Man, they see that as simply a picture of the Romans coming as a tool of the Son of Man with great power and destroying the temple. In the far-term view, this gets even more complicated because this question then becomes, in the far-term view, in the end times, when the Son of Man comes, what is the sign of the Son of Man? And there's a lot of discussion about what that sign is. What is the sign of the Son of Man? In the early church years, it was believed that the sign was a giant cross in the sky. This was the sign of Christ, a cross, and there would be a giant sign, a giant cross in the sky, and that would be the sign of the Son of Man coming. Others just say that, well, it's just simply a bright light, going back to the lightning that we saw back in verse 27. The thing to remember again, that in verse 29, we've turned out all the lights, right? It's been dark for some period of time, not clear how long that is. And then it says in verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Most of the scholars today believe that the sign of the Son of Man that appears in the heaven is the Son of Man himself. It is him in all his glory, in all his brightness, and all his lightningness, right? That is the sign. There's not some other thing that happens. The sign of the Son of Man is the Son of Man coming, because you'll see at the end of the verse, right, it says, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Certainly in power, right, as you've seen, we've already seen the lights go out and all the other things that are occurring. We definitely are seeing the power of the Lord as he comes, and then definitely the glory, the brightness of the Lord is portrayed as he comes in. It's interesting, if you remember, when we look later at when Jesus dies, right, and the disciples stand on the hilltop and they see him going into heaven, and you remember it says that the clouds hid them from their sight, and then the angels spoke out and said, don't worry, Jesus will return in the same way that you have seen him go, right? So here he's saying that, the same way he's coming back on the clouds, in the same way that he left on the clouds, he's coming in the clouds, as if the clouds are transporting him or hiding him. All those pictures are there as we look. The other thing, if just just turn there. So turn to Revelation chapter 1. Revelation chapter 1, and there's just, there's lots of stuff here, but look at verse 7. Revelation 1:7. Behold, he is coming with clouds, and every eye will see him, even they who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn because of him. Even so, amen. Right? So again, he's coming in the clouds. Every eye will see him, right? Every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And then there will be this mourning. So again, go back to Matthew. At the same verse, it says, right, that he will come, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. Why is there mourning going on when the Son of Man comes at the end times. Any thoughts on that?
Most of the people that are alive have rejected him.
Yeah, right. So there's two different things going on. One, as Rick has said, there's a lot of mourning because, we're in deep doo-doo, right? The Son of Man is coming and in all his glory, and they know now that they're in trouble. The other part of that, and let me just make sure you hear this, is that there's a mourning on behalf of the Jews when they realize, boy, we messed up. This is our Messiah. We know it for sure now. And this is when, if you remember, we talked about last time, this is when those who believe that at the end there's going to be a great conversion of the Jews, they believe this is when that happens, right? There's a great mourning on behalf of the Jews. They recognize this is the Messiah, and a great multitude of the Jews become saved during this time, during the early part of the tribulation. So that is the connection with what we talked about earlier. Yeah. So verse 31. You didn't believe I could do this many verses at once, did you? Verse 31. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, again, certainly in the far term understanding of this is when Jesus brings together all of the elect. Again, he's used that word again. This is the redeemed. He brings them together from the four winds, which is simply all the corners of the earth, right? He brings them, and also from one end of heaven to the other, he brings all the elect together at this point. The angels have a great sound of a trumpet in order to do this, right, and bring them all together. So this is all of the those who are redeemed. Now, by the way, just who are these redeemed people? What redeemed people are these?
The elect.
Sorry, Ken? Yeah, which elect?
The ones that get saved after the.
Yeah, to Patty's point, right? If you believe that there's a rapture, the rapture occurs before the tribulation, those people are all gone. So these people that are being collected are those who have been redeemed during the tribulation, right? Those who have been redeemed from before the tribulation are brought together. And then it also says those who are in heaven are brought together. So all of them are brought together. Those who have been brought up in the rapture, those who have been redeemed on the earth, they're all gathered together at this point in time. Okay, then, by the way, in the near-term view of this, the angels that are sent out, the word angels here is simply the word messengers, and they're saying that this is when Jesus sends out his disciples into the world to preach the gospel. Right? They're going out preaching the gospel, and they're gathering together those who are redeemed. In other words, those people are being saved. They're going out across all of the world and preaching the gospel from one end of the earth to the other, and people are being saved. So that's the near-term view of this verse. Verse 32. Now learn this parable. By the way, we're going to verse 35 in case you're wondering, how long is he going to keep this up? Verse 32, now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near, right? So all he's saying here is, spring leads to summer, summer leads to a harvest when you see the branches and tender. So that's just kind of, he's again saying, this is the beginning. These things that we've been talking about are the beginning of the destruction, the beginning of the tribulation. It's no different from what he said back in verse 8, right, where this is the beginning of the birth pains. He's just saying it in a different way here. This is just the tender shoots. It's just the beginning. Summer is near, and the harvest is also near. So verse 33, so you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, it is at the door. So again, for the near-term interpretation, the destruction of the temple is near, the destruction of temple is at the door. For the far-term interpretation, the end of all time is near. and the end of all time is at the door. Verse 34. Verse 34 is the key verse that gets us in trouble. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. And we talked about this a little already, but this verse is why many people look at verses 1 through 34 as having to do with the destruction of the temple. Because their point is, he's saying here that this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. Well, the destruction of the temple happens in AD 70. So these people, this generation of people is still alive when the temple is destroyed. So he's saying that obviously all of these words have to do with prophecy about the destruction of the temple. Otherwise, he wouldn't say this generation will by no means pass away before all these things take place, right? So that is very clear for that one, and that that everything else, and they would say that everything else in here is just kind of exaggerated or symbolic rather than being actual factual. For the end times and the long-term view of these verses, what is this generation? What he's saying is this generation, the generation that sees all these signs, the generation that sees the abomination of desolation, that sees all of the false prophets, that sees the sun darken, the moon not give its light, the generation that sees the angel gives the trumpet, they will not pass away till everything is finished, right? So that interpretation is when he's talking about this generation, he's talking about this generation who sees all these things, who sees the beginning of the tribulation, who sees the birth pains of the tribulation. They will not be pass away until all these things take place. And if you remember from our study of Revelation, that tribulation lasts 7 years. And so he's saying that these people will be around for those 7 years for the tribulation to be completed before the millennial kingdom comes. So let me just pause there a minute. Questions on that? Have I been clear as mud? All right, let's just wrap up with verse 35. Verse 35, heaven and earth will not pass away, but my words, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away, right? He's saying that heaven and earth, as we know them, will pass away, right? Heaven and earth. And this, at this point in time, most of the credible commentaries have shifted their view that really from verse 35 to the end is really talking about the end times. And so that's going to be our interpretation as we go into the rest of chapter 24 and 25 is really looking at these as verses that pertain to the end times and stop this dual interpretation business that's driving me crazy. And we'll just talk about one interpretation of these verses from this point on. But his point is that, all these things that are physical, all these things that are around you, all those things are going to pass away. But my truth, my words, what I have to say, those will not pass away. That truth will stand forever, regardless that this earth will disintegrate. This earth as we know it, as we understand it, is not going to be around. It will be, the skies will be rolled up as a scroll, as he says in Revelation, right? That these things will not be here, but my words, my truth, those things are everlasting. And we'll see that as we get into the rest of the chapter and into chapter 25. All right, I did it. I completed it. It was painful for me. Hopefully it wasn't as painful for you. But, I don't want to, again, when we have great people on two different sides of an interpretation, I don't want to just get hung up on one interpretation. And particularly when we have those people that are on our staff in the church, I don't want to give you one interpretation and have you go, wait a minute, so-and-so said it was this. Yeah, it could be interpreted in two different ways. And that's kind of where we are, particularly with these first 34 verses. Any thoughts on that or any thoughts on any of this before we break into prayer time?
I just got one question for you, Rich. The subject that I didn't hear you address, there's a school of thought that says that the temple will be restored.
Yeah.
And then destroyed. That can tie these two together if that one fact happens. And
yeah, right. In fact, it has to happen. I mean, honestly, for even the folks who believe in the end times view of this, believe that there will be a temple rebuilt, and that temple is where the Antichrist will come back to. So part of the end times belief is that there will be another temple that is built in Jerusalem, and that will be a central point of the second coming. And so, as you said, yeah, that then it could be talking about the destruction of that temple, right? But then you still have this question about the generation. And so again, in my view is there's near-term interpretation and there's far-term interpretation. There's nothing wrong with that because we see that in Scripture over and over and over. Anything else on that, Rick?
To what Rick just said, I mean, I heard the same thing, that basically the temple would be rebuilt. And so, I mean, if you're just devil's advocate, then, the second coming is not going to happen until that happens.
there's a lot of people that point to that as
I've heard that.
the sign of the end times. When the temple
Right.
is restored, then everything is in place for
That's right.
times prophecy to be fulfilled.
That's right. Yep.
You don't know, I mean, believe it or not.
And that's the part that kind of debunks that for me, is that if it was that clear that that's the one thing that has to happen before this unfolds, then that goes against, no one will know the time and place.
Exactly.
And listen, if Jesus decides to come back and there's not a temple rebuilt, I'm going to be okay.
You're out of here.
Right. I mean, if he just comes back to Jerusalem in the place where the old temple was, and all these things happen, it's okay. So, this is why, getting locked down into one particular interpretation of this is, we will find out, right? Hopefully we'll have a pretty good view of the whole thing. All right. Anything else on that? Again, I would just say, you might say, well, gee, why is all this in here? I think, again, Jesus is trying to say, you got to pay attention. Pay attention to what's going on around you, right? Don't just sit back and say everything's fine. No, we got a tribulation coming, and we got a lot of things ahead. So pay attention to false prophecy, to pay attention to what's going on in the world. Pay attention to the rise of false Christs, those people who say, hey, I'm the savior, I'm going to get everything fixed, I'm going to make sure everything's okay. There's going to be several of those before the big Antichrist come. And so watch out for those people, because you remember the false Christ, the Antichrist comes and he makes good friends with Jerusalem, with Israel, and then halfway through the 7 years, he destroys them all. So this is the wolf, the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing, is the Antichrist. So, all right. With that, let's turn to prayer requests. I'll turn off the recording. So most of you recognize that we are not in Smithfield.